The morning sun cast long shadows across Fort Henderson's main armory as Elise Cade pushed through the heavy metal doors, her worn combat boots making barely a whisper against the concrete floor. At 38, she moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned that drawing attention could mean the difference between life and death. Her faded military fatigues bore no name tape, no unit patches, no ribbons or commendations. Just a woman in old clothes, assigned to the backup weapons storage area that most soldiers forgot even existed. The quartermaster had mumbled something about budget cuts when he'd shown her to the dusty corner where surplus rifles waited for maintenance. "Great, they're sending logistics to do our job now," muttered Private Danny Morrison, barely 22 and fresh from basic training. He watched as Elise settled into the corner workspace, her short brown hair tucked behind her ears as she began methodically laying out cleaning supplies. Corporal Jake Williams laughed as he signed out his squad's weapons for morning drills. "Budget cuts, man. Cheaper to pay some civilian contractor than real soldiers." He raised his voice slightly, making sure the woman could hear. "Hey, you ever actually fired one of those things or just read about them in a manual?" Elise didn't look up from the rifle she was disassembling. Her movements were precise, deliberate, each component separated with the kind of muscle memory that spoke of countless repetitions. The bolt carrier group came apart in her hands like she'd done 1,000 times before. "Careful with that trigger mechanism," called out Sergeant Tom Richards from across the room. "It's not a toy. You break it, the paperwork's gonna be a nightmare." A quiet smile played at the corners of Elise's mouth as she continued her work. The weapon felt familiar in her hands, its weight and balance as natural as breathing. She'd cleaned this exact model in conditions these soldiers couldn't imagine, with enemy patrols searching the mountainsides and nothing but moonlight to work by. The armory hummed with its usual morning activity. Soldiers checking out equipment, technicians running diagnostic tests, officers reviewing inventory sheets. And in the corner, a woman who looked completely unremarkable continued her methodical work, invisible to everyone who passed by. "Ma'am," said Corporal Lisa Patterson, approaching with what she clearly thought was helpful concern. "If you need assistance with the technical specifications, I can walk you through the proper procedures. These weapon systems can be pretty complex for someone without formal training." Elise nodded politely, her calm expression never changing. "I appreciate that, but I think I can manage." Her hands moved across the weapon with practiced ease, each motion flowing into the next. Disassembly, inspection, cleaning, reassembly. The sequence was flawless, professional, and completely at odds with what everyone assumed about her background. Staff Sergeant Mike Thompson paused in his paperwork to watch. "You're pretty good with that for someone from supply. Where do you learn to handle weapons like that?" "Military training course," Elise replied simply. "Something like that." The morning wore on, and Elise became part of the background noise. Just another face in the crowd, another support person doing maintenance work. Her uniform was faded, her presence unremarkable, her story untold. But something about the way she handled those weapons suggested depths that no one bothered to explore. The way she tested firing mechanisms with professional precision. The way she rotated heavy rifles with one hand while cleaning components with the other. The way she seemed to anticipate how each weapon would respond before she even touched it. These weren't the movements of someone who had learned from YouTube videos or training manuals. These were the movements of someone who had once depended on these exact weapons for survival, who had carried them through places where failure meant death, who had trusted her life to their mechanical precision. But nobody asked questions. Nobody looked beyond the faded uniform and unremarkable appearance. She was just another contractor, another budget cut, another invisible person doing invisible work in the corner of a busy armory. Private Morrison whispered to his buddy, Why do they have civilians doing weapons maintenance anyway? Seems like something actual soldiers should handle. Budget cuts? Probably, came the reply. Cheaper than paying someone who actually knows what they're doing. They had no idea they were talking about someone who had once carried weapons into situations that would have given them nightmares. Someone who had survived in hostile territory for months, maintaining equipment with improvised tools and stolen supplies. Someone whose expertise had been earned in the kind of classroom where graduation meant staying alive another day. As the morning shift ended and soldiers began filing out for their training exercises, Elise continued her quiet work. She finished cleaning one rifle, inspected it thoroughly, and moved on to the next. The same methodical process, the same professional attention to detail, the same invisible presence in the corner of a room full of people who never really saw her. But visibility was about to change. In just a few hours, a single rolled-up sleeve would reveal something that would transform how everyone in that armory saw the quiet woman with the faded uniform and the steady hands. Something that would make a general freeze in his tracks and remember a unit he thought had been lost forever. The afternoon heat made the armory stifling, and Elise pushed up her sleeves as she worked on a particularly stubborn bolt assembly. The movement was casual, automatic, born from years of working in conditions far hotter than a climate-controlled military facility. But that simple gesture changed everything. On her left bicep, revealed for the first time, was a tattoo that made Sergeant First Class Robert Hayes stop mid-sentence. A black dragon, intricately detailed, wrapped around block letters that read Omega 13. "Wait a minute," Hayes said, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet armory. "That tattoo. What unit did you serve with?" Elise glanced up, seemingly unaware of the attention her exposed arm had drawn. "I served where I was needed," she replied simply, returning to her work. But the damage was done. Other soldiers had noticed the marking, and whispers began circulating like wildfire through the room. "Omega 13, muttered Staff Sergeant Kelly Brooks, pulling out her phone. "That designation sounds familiar, but I can't place it." Private Morrison, the same soldier who had mocked her earlier, approached with newfound curiosity. "Ma'am, that's not a standard unit designation. I've never seen anything like it in the current structure." "No," Elise agreed quietly. "It wasn't standard." The questions multiplied as more soldiers gathered around, drawn by the mystery of a unit designation that none of them recognized, but all of them found somehow significant. The tattoo was clearly military, clearly official, but completely outside their experience. "I'm going to look this up," announced Corporal James Foster, his fingers already working on his smartphone. "There's got to be a record somewhere." "Don't," Elise said, her voice quiet but carrying an unmistakable note of authority. Some things are better left alone. But curiosity had taken hold, and Foster continued his search through military databases and unit histories. Most searches returned nothing. No official records, no personnel rosters, no unit histories. It was as if Omega 13 had never existed. Then he found something. A single reference, buried in a declassified after-action report from 15 years ago. A footnote that made the color drain from his face. "This can't be right," he whispered, staring at his screen. "This says Omega 13 was a specialist survival unit deployed to the Eastern Andes. Says they were all killed in action after an improvised explosive device detonated at their position." The armory fell silent, except for the hum of ventilation systems and the distant sound of training exercises outside. Every eye turned to Elise, who had paused in her cleaning but didn't look up. "It says here complete unit loss. No survivors recovered," Foster continued, his voice getting stronger. With disbelief. "But you're here. You're right here." Elise finally looked up, her expression calm and steady. Reports aren't always accurate. But this is an official military document, Foster protested. It says everyone in Omega-13 was killed. No survivors. 3 of us survived, Elise replied, her voice matter-of-fact. The weight of that statement settled over the room like a heavy blanket. These soldiers had been joking about logistics personnel and civilian contractors, but they were looking at someone who had literally risen from the dead, according to official records. What happened to the other 2? Asked Private Morrison, his earlier mockery replaced by genuine concern. They went home, Elise said simply. I stayed. Why? The question came from multiple voices. Elise considered her answer carefully. Because someone needed to remember. Someone needed to carry on. The implications of her words hit the room like a physical force. This wasn't just a random support person assigned to weapon maintenance. This was someone with a story. Someone who had survived something that had officially killed everyone else. Someone who had chosen to continue serving despite having every reason to walk away. Why are you here? Asked Sergeant Brooks. In the armory, you could have recognition, proper rank, commendations. Elise returned to cleaning the rifle in her hands. I don't need recognition. I need to be useful. The tattoo on her arm seemed different now, viewed through the lens of what they'd learned. Not just old ink marking military service, but a memorial. A reminder, a connection to people who hadn't made it home. Ma'am, said Corporal Patterson, approaching with newfound respect. If you're really from Omega-13, why isn't this in your personnel file? Why aren't there records? Because some operations, some people, are better forgotten officially, Elise replied, without looking up. What does that mean? It means I choose to serve quietly, without questions, without explanations. The armory continued its daily routine. But now everyone moved differently around Elise. The casual dismissal was gone, replaced by a mixture of respect and curiosity. They were looking at someone who carried secrets, someone who had survived the impossible, someone whose presence in their small corner of the military might not be coincidence. As the afternoon wore on, word spread through the base like wildfire. The quiet woman in the armory wasn't just another contractor. She was a ghost, a survivor, a living reminder of an operation that had officially never happened and people who had officially never existed. But she just kept cleaning weapons, methodically and professionally, as if nothing had changed. As if the revelation of her tattoo hadn't just turned their entire understanding of her upside down. She was still the same person who had walked in that morning. Still quiet, still focused, still completely committed to making sure every weapon that passed through her hands would work perfectly when someone's life depended on it. The only difference now was that people were beginning to understand why that mattered so much to her. General Marcus Hardwell had commanded forces in the Eastern Andes campaign 15 years ago. He'd also signed the death certificates for 12. Specialists from Omega-13 had personally written letters to their families and had carried the weight of that loss ever since. So when he walked into the armory for an unscheduled inspection and saw the Black Dragon tattoo on Elise's arm, his world shifted on its axis. For several heartbeats, the room was completely silent. The general stood frozen, his eyes locked on the marking that represented one of the most classified operations he'd ever overseen. An operation that had ended in tragedy, with no survivors and no happy endings. Except, apparently, there had been survivors. Who are you? He asked quietly, his voice carrying the weight of command but also something else. Something that sounded like hope mixed with disbelief. Elise looked up from the rifle she was cleaning, her expression calm and steady. Staff Sergeant Elise Cade, sir. Survival Technical Team Leader, Omega-13. General Hartwell's breath caught. He'd memorized the names of every person in that unit, had reviewed their files countless times, had carried their memory through 15 years of sleepless nights. And now one of them was standing in front of him, alive and whole and cleaning weapons in his base armory. That unit, he said carefully, was listed as killed in action. The entire team was lost after an explosive device detonated at your position. Only 3 of us survived, sir, Elise replied. But we were kept classified for security reasons. I chose to stay in service, but in the background, where no one had to remember my face. The general processed this information, his mind racing through implications and possibilities. Then, slowly and deliberately, he came to attention and raised his hand in a full military salute. The significance of the gesture hit everyone in the room like a physical blow. A general saluting a woman they'd thought was just warehouse staff. The respect in that salute said everything about who Elise really was and what she'd accomplished. Omega 13 was a specialized unit, General Hartwell said, speaking to the room while maintaining his salute. Survival experts. They were sent into impossible situations, places where regular forces couldn't operate. What kind of places? Asked Private Morrison, his voice barely above a whisper. Behind enemy lines, cut off from support, living off the land for months. Gathering intelligence, sabotaging supply lines, completing missions that existed only in classified files. Elise continued cleaning her rifle, not looking for attention or recognition. Just doing her job, while the general explained what that job had once been. They were deployed to the Eastern Andes during the height of the insurgency, Hartwell continued. 12 specialists, the best we had. They were supposed to extract after 6 months, but communications went dark. Search and rescue found evidence of an explosion, equipment, personal effects. No survivors. The room remained silent, except for the steady sound of Elise's cleaning cloth against metal components. We held memorial services, notified families, closed the operation, the general said. I personally signed the death certificates. But we survived, Elise said quietly. The explosion was real. Most of the team was killed instantly. 3 of us were thrown clear, injured but alive. Why didn't you report in? Asked Staff Sergeant Brooks. We tried, but our communications were compromised. Enemy forces were hunting survivors. We had to stay hidden. For how long? General, Hartwell asked, though something in his voice suggested he already knew the answer would be difficult to hear. 18 months, Elise replied. Living in the mountains, avoiding patrols, staying alive. The general's expression tightened. 18 months behind enemy lines, with no support, no resupply, no contact with friendly forces. The kind of survival situation that broke most people within weeks. When we finally re-established contact, he said slowly, we were told all survivors had been extracted. I never knew anyone was left behind. The other 2 were extracted, Elise confirmed. They were more seriously injured, needed medical attention. I stayed to complete the mission. Alone? For 6 more months, until the region was stabilized. The room absorbed this information in stunned silence. 2 years behind enemy lines. 2 years of survival in hostile territory. 2 years of completing a mission that had officially ended in complete failure. Why aren't you in the records? General Hartwell asked. Why isn't this in your personnel file? Because some operations, some people, are better served by staying invisible, Elise replied. It means I can do my job without questions, without explanations, without people treating me differently. But you deserve recognition, said Corporal Foster. Medals, commendations, proper rank. Elise looked at him with something that might have been amusement. I have everything I need. I'm alive. I'm serving. I'm useful. General Hartwell lowered his salute, but his expression remained respectful. The tattoo, is that for the others? Elise touched the dragon on her arm gently. 9 names. 9 friends. 9 people who should have come home. And you carry them with you. In everything I do, she confirmed. The general addressed the room again. This woman survived conditions that would break most people. She completed a mission that was supposed to be impossible, and she chose to continue serving without recognition, without glory. He looked directly at Elise. You could have gone home, could have retired, could have lived quietly as a civilian. I'm living quietly, Elise replied. Right here, doing what needs to be done. Why the armory? Because these weapons need to work perfectly. Lives depend on them. People like my team depend on them. General Hartwell nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. You're still protecting people. That's what we do. The room remained silent as the weight of what they'd learned settled over them. This wasn't just a support person doing maintenance work. This was a survivor, a guardian, a living memorial to people who hadn't made it home. And she'd chosen to honor them through daily service, through quiet dedication, through making sure that other soldiers would have the tools they needed to come home alive. The general stood there for a long moment, processing the miracle of finding someone he thought was lost forever. Then he spoke again, his voice carrying 15 years of regret and newfound hope. Staff Sergeant Cade, welcome home. Word of the general's salute spread through Fort Henderson like wildfire. By evening, everyone on base knew that the quiet woman in the armory was someone special. Not her full story, not all the details, but enough to understand that she deserved their respect. The next morning, the atmosphere in the armory was completely different. Second Lieutenant Amanda Price approached Elise's workstation with genuine humility. Ma'am, if you have time, could you show me how to maintain weapons in adverse conditions? I've read the manuals, but I get the feeling that's not the same as real experience. Elise looked up from the rifle she was cleaning, studied the young officer's face, and nodded. Field conditions are different from anything you'll learn in a classroom. As she began demonstrating techniques for cleaning weapons with improvised materials, other soldiers gathered around. Not to mock or question, but to learn from someone who had clearly mastered skills they could only imagine needing. In the field, you might not have proper cleaning solvents, Elise explained, showing them how to break down carbon buildup using materials that could be found in any environment. But weapon maintenance isn't optional. A dirty rifle is a dead soldier. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, demonstrating tricks that weren't in any manual. How to field strip a weapon in complete darkness. How to prevent corrosion in humid conditions. How to maintain accuracy when precision cleaning wasn't possible. Where did you learn all this? Asked Corporal Patterson. Trial and error, Elise replied. Mostly error, until I figured out what worked. Private Morrison, who had been one of her harshest critics the day before, listened intently to every word. Ma'am, I owe you an apology. I shouldn't have assumed you didn't know what you were doing. Elise paused in her demonstration. You didn't know. Most people make judgments based on what they can see. It's natural, but it wasn't right. No, she agreed, but it also wasn't malicious. You're young. You're learning. That's what matters. The morning passed with Elise sharing knowledge she'd gained through necessity and survival. Not dramatic stories or war tales, but practical information that could keep soldiers alive in the field. The kind of expertise that couldn't be taught in schools or training facilities. Staff Sergeant Brooks approached during a quiet moment. Ma'am, do you ever think about your team? The ones who didn't make it? Elise's hands stilled on the weapon she was cleaning. Every day. But I don't think about what I lost. I think about what I can still do. What do you mean? They can't clean these weapons anymore. They can't maintain this equipment. They can't make sure it works when someone needs it. She resumed her methodical cleaning. But I can, so I do. The simple logic of her statement hit everyone who heard it. This wasn't about glory or recognition. This was about continuing to serve, continuing to protect, continuing to honor the memory of fallen comrades through daily dedication. "Don't you want people to know about what you did?" asked Lieutenant Price. "About what you survived?" Elise looked around the room at the faces watching her. "Now, that's enough. But there should be records, official recognition." "There are records," Elise said quietly. "They're just not in files." She pointed to her tattoo. "They're here, in the work we do, in the people we protect." As the afternoon shift began, new soldiers entered the armory. The daily routine continued, but something fundamental had changed. The story was spreading, but not as gossip or rumor, as truth, as understanding of what real service looked like. A young private from the motor pool approached nervously. "Ma'am, if you ever need anything at all, just let me know." "I need these weapons to work perfectly," Elise replied. "That's all. But personally, if you ever need help with anything, I have everything I need. I have purpose. I have work that matters." The private nodded and walked away, but his offer represented something important. Elise had earned not just respect, but genuine care from the soldiers around her. They wanted to take care of someone who had clearly spent years taking care of others. By evening, the transformation was complete. The woman who had been invisible 24 hours earlier was now seen and valued by everyone who worked in the armory. Not because she'd demanded recognition, but because she'd earned it through quiet competence and genuine service. As her shift ended, Elise packed up her cleaning supplies and prepared to leave. A young soldier stopped her at the door. "Ma'am, thank you." "For what?" "For staying, for continuing, for being here." Elise nodded once, simple and quiet, then walked out into the evening air. But her presence remained in the perfectly maintained weapons, in the respect of the soldiers, in the knowledge that had been shared, and in the understanding that some heroes don't need monuments or medals. They just need their work to matter. 3 days after the general's visit, Elise noticed she was being watched. Not with suspicion or curiosity anymore, but with something deeper. The soldiers in the armory had begun treating her not just as an expert, but as a guardian of memory. It started with small things. Private Morrison began arriving early to help set up her workstation. Corporal Patterson made sure the good cleaning supplies were always available for her use. Staff Sergeant Brooks quietly rearranged the duty roster so that interruptions during Elise's work were minimized. But the real change came when Colonel Janet Rivera, the base commander, entered the armory unannounced. "Staff Sergeant Cade," she said, approaching Elise's corner workspace. "I'd like to speak with you privately." Elise looked up from the rifle she was cleaning, her expression calm but alert. "Of course, ma'am." They walked to a small office adjacent to the main armory floor. Colonel Rivera closed the door and gestured for Elise to sit, but she remained standing. "I've been reviewing what records we have of Omega-13, the colonel began. "It's not much, but it's enough to understand that you've been significantly underutilized here." "I'm serving where I'm needed," Elise replied. "Are you?" "Because what I'm seeing is someone with extraordinary qualifications working in a position that doesn't begin to use her capabilities." Elise considered this. Sometimes the most important work looks ordinary. Colonel Rivera studied her carefully. "General Hartwell spoke with me at length about your unit, about what you accomplished. He believes you should be training our special operations personnel, sharing your expertise with people who might face similar situations." "I'm already sharing my expertise. Cleaning weapons in a supply armory, making sure those weapons work when someone's life depends on them," Elise corrected. "Teaching soldiers how to maintain equipment in adverse conditions, carrying on the work my team started." The colonel leaned back in her chair. I've read the after-action reports from the Eastern Andes. What's in them anyway?" "Most of it's classified above my clearance level. But I've seen enough to understand that what you survived should have been impossible. Elise's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes suggested she was remembering things she'd rather forget. 24 months behind enemy lines, Colonel Rivera continued. No support, no resupply, no communication with friendly forces. Most soldiers would have broken within weeks. Most soldiers weren't trained for what we were trained for. What were you trained for? Elise was quiet for a long moment. To survive, to adapt, to complete the mission regardless of circumstances. And you did, for 2 years. We did what we had to do. The colonel stood and walked to the window, looking out at the base where hundreds of soldiers went about their daily routines. I have young soldiers here who think they're tough because they've completed basic training, who think they understand what service means because they've been deployed to safe zones with full logistical support. She turned back to Elise. What? Would you tell them about real service? That it's not about being tough, Elise replied immediately. It's about being useful, about doing what needs to be done, whether anyone notices or not. Is that why you chose to stay invisible? To avoid recognition? I chose to stay invisible because the work matters more than the worker. Because my team can't receive recognition anymore, but their mission can continue. Colonel Rivera nodded slowly. What was your mission, exactly? To protect people. To gather information that would save lives. To disrupt enemy operations that threatened our forces. Elise paused. To make sure that other soldiers could come home to their families. And you're still doing that. Every day. Every weapon I clean. Every soldier I teach. Every piece of equipment I maintain. It's all part of the same mission. The colonel returned to her desk. I want to offer you a position training our special operations candidates. Better pay, proper recognition, official acknowledgement of your service record. I appreciate the offer, ma'am, but I'm needed in the armory. Why? Elise looked toward the door, toward the sounds of soldiers going about their daily work. Because that's where the weapons are. That's where the young soldiers come to learn. That's where I can make sure that when someone needs their equipment to work, it will. You could do more in a training position. I could do different things. I'm not sure they'd be more important. Colonel Rivera studied her for a long moment. You know, most people who've been through what you've been through would want the recognition, would want their story told. Most people who've been through what I've been through didn't make it home, Elise replied quietly. I'm not most people. No, the colonel agreed. You're not. They sat in silence for a few minutes, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Colonel Rivera spoke again. If you won't accept the transfer, will you at least accept the proper rank? Your service record, what I can see of it, suggests you should be wearing sergeant major stripes, not working as unranked support staff. Elise considered this. Rank brings attention. Attention brings questions. Questions bring complications. It also brings respect. I have respect. From the people who matter. From the soldiers whose lives might depend on the work I do. The colonel smiled slightly. You know, I've been commanding soldiers for 20 years. I've never met anyone quite like you. I hope not. There shouldn't be anyone quite like me. The situations that created me shouldn't exist. But they do exist. And because they do, we need people like you. Elise stood to leave. You have people like me, ma'am. You just don't always recognize them. They're the ones doing the work that needs to be done, whether anyone notices or not. As she reached the door, Colonel Rivera called out, Staff Sergeant Cade, if you ever change your mind about that position, it's yours. Elise nodded once and returned to her corner of the armory, where a fresh batch of weapons waited for her attention. As she settled back into her routine, she was aware that the conversation had changed something. Not her commitment to the work, but perhaps the understanding that her choice to remain invisible was itself a form of service. The tattoo on her arm caught the light as she worked, and she touched it gently. 9 names, 9 friends, 9 people whose mission she carried forward every day through quiet dedication and professional excellence. Some monuments were built of stone and bronze. Others were built of daily service and remembered purpose. She preferred the latter. 2 weeks after Colonel Rivera's offer, Elise noticed changes throughout the base that she hadn't expected. Word of her story had spread beyond the armory, and it was affecting how soldiers approached their own service. It started with Private Morrison, who had begun asking different questions during his weekly equipment checks. Instead of just signing out his rifle and leaving, he stayed to learn proper maintenance techniques. He'd brought other soldiers from his unit, and they'd formed an informal group that met during off-duty hours to learn advanced weapon care. "Ma'am," Morrison said one afternoon, "could you show us how to maintain accuracy when you can't properly clean the barrel?" My buddy deployed to Afghanistan said they had situations where they couldn't do normal maintenance for weeks. Elise looked up from the rifle she was working on, surprised by the specificity of the question. That's a real concern in extended operations. The key is understanding what's critical versus what's optimal. As she began demonstrating techniques for maintaining weapon function in adverse conditions, she noticed that the soldiers were taking notes. Real notes, as if they were in a classroom rather than a supply armory. "The thing to remember," she explained, "is that a weapon doesn't have to be perfect to be functional, but it does have to be reliable. That means understanding which components are critical and which can tolerate temporary neglect." Sergeant Brooks approached during the impromptu lesson. "Ma'am, I've been thinking about something you said. About doing what needs to be done whether anyone notices or not." Elise paused in her demonstration. "What about it?" "I've been watching how soldiers approach their duties since word got out about your background. People are paying more attention to details they used to ignore. Doing better work when no one's watching. Why do you think that is? Because you showed them what real service looks like. Not the kind that gets you medals or promotions, but the kind that actually matters." The observation stayed with Elise as she continued her work. She'd chosen invisibility to avoid complicating her mission, but somehow her story was inspiring others to take their own responsibilities more seriously. The ripple effect became more apparent over the following days. Soldiers began approaching their equipment maintenance with new diligence. The quality of work in the armory improved noticeably. Even seasoned NCOs began asking questions about techniques they'd never considered important. Master Sergeant David Chen, a 20-year veteran, stopped by during his lunch break. "Ma'am, I've been thinking about my own service record. 20 years in, and I've been focused on advancement, on making rank, on getting the right assignments." "Those things matter," Elise replied. "Do they? I mean, really? When I look at what you've accomplished, what you've chosen to do, it makes me wonder if I've been measuring success wrong." Elise considered her response carefully. Success isn't about comparison. It's about contribution. You've served for 20 years, trained soldiers, completed missions, kept people safe. That matters. But I could be doing more. I could be focusing on the work instead of the recognition. "You could," Elise agreed. "But that's a choice everyone has to make for themselves." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a delegation from the base education office. Captain Robert Wilson, the officer in charge of continuing education programs, approached with what appeared to be a formal proposal. "Staff Sergeant Cade," he began, "I'd like to discuss developing a curriculum based on your experience. Advanced survival techniques, equipment maintenance in austere conditions, leadership in extreme situations." Elise looked at the materials he was carrying, clearly prepared for a lengthy presentation. "I'm not an instructor, Captain, but you have knowledge that could save lives. techniques that aren't taught in any formal program, experience that can't be gained in peacetime training. I share that knowledge every day, right here with the soldiers who need it. Captain Wilson gestured around the armory. But this is limited. A formal program could reach hundreds of soldiers, maybe thousands. And turn what I do into a curriculum, make it academic, make it available, make it official, make it part of how we train our people. Elise returned to her cleaning, her movements steady and methodical. The things I know weren't learned in classrooms. They were learned through necessity, through failure, through watching friends die because we didn't know better. That's exactly why they need to be taught, so other soldiers don't have to learn them the same way. Some things can't be taught. They can only be experienced. Captain Wilson persisted, but the fundamentals can be taught. The basic principles, the core techniques, the mindset. The mindset isn't teachable. It's developed through circumstances no one should have to face. Then, at least the technical skills, the survival techniques, the equipment maintenance procedures. Elise looked up from her work, studying the captain's face. Why is this important to you? Because I've seen the reports from recent deployments. Soldiers failing in situations where better training might have made a difference. Equipment failures that could have been prevented. Lives lost because people didn't know what you know. The weight of his words settled over the armory. Everyone within earshot was listening now, understanding that this wasn't just about curriculum development, but about the practical application of hard-won knowledge. If I were to do this, Elise said slowly, it wouldn't be in a classroom. It wouldn't be theoretical. It would be hands-on, practical, and focused on keeping people alive. Captain Wilson nodded eagerly. Whatever format works best. We're flexible, and it wouldn't replace what I do here. This work continues. These weapons still need maintenance. These soldiers still need training. Of course, we could work around your current duties. Elise was quiet for a long moment, her hands continuing their methodical work while she considered the proposal. Finally, she looked up at the gathering of soldiers who had been listening to the conversation. What do you think? She asked them. Would formal training help, or would it just complicate something that works? Private Morrison spoke first. Ma'am, what you've taught us here has already made a difference. If more soldiers could learn the same things. But it wouldn't be the same, interrupted Sergeant Brooks. What we learn here is because we work with you, watch you, understand why these things matter. In a classroom, it would just be another course to complete. That's my concern, Elise admitted. Knowledge without context becomes routine. Routine without understanding becomes habit. And habits can get people killed when circumstances change. Captain Wilson looked disappointed but not defeated. What if we could find a way to provide the context? To make sure soldiers understand not just what to do, but why it matters. How? By having them work with you. Here, in the armory. By making this part of their training rotation. By letting them see what real expertise looks like in action. Elise considered this proposal more carefully. Instead of taking her away from her work, it would bring more soldiers to the work. Instead of formalizing her knowledge, it would expand the informal education that was already happening. That might work, she said finally, but it would have to be voluntary. No one gets assigned here who doesn't want to be here. Why? Because the soldiers who learn the most are the ones who understand that this matters. You can't teach someone to care. They have to discover that for themselves. Captain Wilson made notes on his proposal. We could structure it as advanced training for soldiers who request it. Voluntary participation, practical application, real-world experience. And no certificates, no formal graduation, no addition to service records, Elise added. The knowledge is the reward. The ability to do the job better is the recognition. That's unusual for a military training program. Most military training programs don't teach what I teach. What I teach keeps people alive when everything else fails. That should be reward enough. As the afternoon wore on, the proposal took shape around the reality of Elise's work rather than trying to reshape her work around institutional requirements. Soldiers would rotate through the armory for extended periods, learning through observation and practice rather than lecture and examination. "There's one more thing," Elise said as Captain Wilson prepared to leave. "Anyone who comes here to learn needs to understand what this represents." She touched the tattoo on her arm. "This isn't about personal advancement or career development. This is about honoring people who can't teach these lessons themselves. About carrying forward knowledge that was paid for with blood. I understand. Do you? Because every technique I demonstrate, every procedure I teach, every piece of equipment I maintain represents something my teammates learned through necessity. They're not here to pass on that knowledge, so I am." Captain Wilson looked around the armory, seeing it differently now. Not just a maintenance facility, but a memorial. A place where the lessons of the fallen were kept alive through daily practice and quiet dedication. "I'll make sure everyone understands," he said quietly. "This isn't just training. It's remembrance." As he left, Elise returned to her work with the satisfaction of knowing that her mission was expanding without being compromised. More soldiers would learn the skills they might need to survive impossible situations. More people would understand what real service looked like. More of her teammates' sacrifice would find purpose in the lives that might be saved. The tattoo on her arm seemed to catch the light as she worked, and she smiled slightly. 9 names carried forward through the hands and minds of soldiers who would never know their names but would benefit from their sacrifice. Some legacies were written in history books. Others were written in the survival of people who came home because someone else had learned the hard way how to keep them alive. She preferred the latter. 1 month after Captain Wilson's proposal was approved, Elise faced her first real challenge since revealing her identity. A group of 6 soldiers had been selected for the new program, volunteers who had demonstrated both competence and genuine interest in advanced training. Among them was Staff Sergeant Michael Torres, a 12-year veteran with multiple deployments who had specifically requested the assignment. His presence concerned Elise, not because of his qualifications, but because of his attitude. "So, you're the famous ghost soldier," Torres said on his first day, examining the weapons she had laid out for cleaning. "I've heard quite a story about you." "I'm someone who cleans weapons," Elise replied simply. "That's what you're here to learn." "Right. Weapon maintenance from someone who supposedly survived 2 years behind enemy lines." His tone carried just enough skepticism to make the other soldiers uncomfortable. Elise continued her work without responding to the challenge in his voice. She'd encountered skepticism before, and she knew that arguing wouldn't convince anyone of anything. Only demonstration would matter. "Staff Sergeant Torres," she said. After a few minutes, "Tell me about your deployment experience." 3 tours, Iraq and Afghanistan. Standard combat operations, convoy security, forward operating base defense. Equipment failures? Sure, some. Mostly preventable with proper maintenance. What about emergency maintenance? Field expedient. Repairs when you couldn't follow standard procedures? Torres shrugged. "We made do. Use what we had available. Show me." She handed him a rifle that had been deliberately damaged to simulate field conditions. The bolt was fouled with debris, the firing pin was stuck, and the barrel had been deliberately contaminated. With a mixture designed to simulate extended use without proper cleaning. Make this weapon functional using only what you can find in this room. Torres examined the rifle, identified the obvious problems, and began working. His technique was competent, but by the book, following standard procedures, even when they weren't appropriate for the conditions. After 20 minutes, he had made progress, but the weapon was still not fully functional. "I'd need proper cleaning supplies and maybe some replacement parts. Those aren't available. Your unit has been cut off for 3 weeks. You have what's in your pack and what you can improvise. The weapon needs to work in 6 hours when your position comes under attack." Torres looked frustrated. "That's not realistic. There are protocols for equipment failure in the field." "Protocols assume logistics support," Elise replied. "What happens when that support isn't available?" She took the rifle and began working with materials that shouldn't have been adequate for the task. A piece of fabric from her uniform became a makeshift cleaning patch. Wire from a discarded electronics component became a field-expedient tool for extracting stuck components. Motor oil from a maintenance cart became temporary lubrication. Within 15 minutes, the weapon was fully functional. "How?" asked Private Jessica Murphy, one of the other soldiers in the program. "By understanding what's absolutely necessary versus what's preferred," Elise explained. "Standard procedures work when you have standard resources. When you don't, you adapt." Torres examined the rifle, clearly impressed despite his initial skepticism. "Where did you learn to do that?" "Trial and error. Mostly error, until people started dying when I got it wrong." The blunt honesty of her statement silenced the room. These weren't theoretical exercises or training scenarios. They were techniques, developed under circumstances where failure meant death. "The cleaning solution you made," said Corporal David Kim, another program participant. "That combination shouldn't work." "It doesn't work well," Elise agreed, "but it works well enough. When you're trying to stay alive, well enough is often all you need." Over the following days, Torres's attitude began to change. He approached each exercise with increasing seriousness, recognizing that he was learning things that weren't taught in any formal program. Techniques that could mean the difference between coming home and not coming home. "Ma'am," he said during the second week, "I owe you an apology. I thought this was going to be some kind of publicity stunt, getting to train with the famous survivor. What changed your mind? Understanding that you're not famous. You're competent. There's a difference." "What's the difference?" "Famous people want attention. Competent people want results." Elise nodded approvingly. "What kind of results do you want from this training?" "I want to know that if I'm ever in a situation where everything goes wrong, I'll still be able to do my job. I want to know that the soldiers under my command will have the best possible chance of making it home. Then you understand why this matters." As the program progressed, Elise found herself facing a different kind of challenge. The soldiers were learning quickly, but they were also asking questions about her experience that went beyond technical training. "Ma'am," said Private Murphy during a break between exercises, "what was it like? Being alone for so long, knowing that everyone thought you were dead?" Elise considered the question carefully, isolating, but also clarifying. When everything else is stripped away, you discover what really matters. What really matters? Completing the mission. Staying alive long enough to be useful. Honoring the people who didn't make it by making sure their sacrifice meant something. How do you honor people who are gone? By living better than you would have without them. By being more than you could have been alone. By carrying forward what they taught you and what they died trying to accomplish. Torres joined the conversation. "Is that why you stayed in the military? To honor your team?" "I stayed because this is where I can be most useful. Because these skills, this knowledge, it needs to be passed on. Because somewhere, someday, what I teach here might keep someone else's team from being lost." "Do you think about them every day?" Elise touched the tattoo on her arm. "I think about them every time I clean a weapon. Every time I teach a technique. Every time I help someone understand how to do their job better. They're part of everything I do." The room was quiet for several minutes, each soldier processing. The weight of what they were learning. Not just technical skills, but perspective. Not just survival techniques, but purpose. "Ma'am," said Corporal Kim finally, "thank you for sharing this with us. I know it can't be easy." "It's not about easy," Elise replied. "It's about necessary. You're going to face situations where what you learn here might matter. When that happens, my team will be there with you, in the knowledge they helped me gain and the techniques they helped me develop. We won't let them down," promised Torres. "You won't let yourselves down," Elise corrected. "That's what they would want. That's what this is all about." As the day ended and the soldiers filed out, Elise remained in the armory with the weapons that still needed maintenance. But something had changed during the training session. The work felt lighter, more purposeful, more connected to the larger mission of keeping people alive. Her teammates were gone, but their knowledge lived on in the hands and minds of soldiers who would face their own impossible situations with better tools and better understanding. The tattoo on her arm caught the light as she worked, and she felt a moment of satisfaction. The mission continued, passed from hand to hand, from mind to mind, from one generation of soldiers to the next. Some things were too important to die with the people who learned them first. 6 months after the advanced training program began, Elise received news that would test everything she had built at Fort Henderson. 3 of her former students, including Staff Sergeant Torres and Private Murphy, had been deployed to a classified operation in a hostile region where communications were unreliable and logistic support was minimal. The notification came through official channels, but the details were sparse. What she knew was that they were facing exactly the kind of conditions she had trained them for, in a place where improvisation and adaptability would matter more than textbook procedures. General Hartwell visited her personally to deliver what information he could share. "They're in a situation that requires extended operations with minimal support," he told her privately. "The kind of deployment where the skills you've been teaching could make the difference between success and failure." How minimal is minimal? Think Eastern Andes, 15 years ago. The comparison hit Elise like a physical blow. Her former students were facing conditions similar to what had killed most of her team. The training she provided might be all that stood between them and the same fate that had claimed 9 of her friends. "When will you have communication?" With them, scheduled check-in is in 72 hours. After that, it's every week until the operation concludes. Elise returned to her work in the armory, but her focus had shifted. Every weapon she cleaned, every procedure she performed, every technique she demonstrated to new students carried additional weight. Somewhere in a hostile territory, soldiers were depending on knowledge she had passed on, skills she had taught, wisdom her team had paid for with their lives. The 72 hours passed slowly. When General Hartwell appeared in the armory again, Elise could read the news in his expression before he spoke. They made contact. "Operation is proceeding successfully. All personnel are accounted for and mission capable." Relief flooded through her, but she kept working. One successful check-in didn't guarantee anything. She'd learned that lesson in the Eastern Andes, where everything could change in minutes. Did they report any equipment issues? Negative. All systems functioning normally despite challenging environmental conditions. Good. The maintenance techniques are working. General Hartwell studied her carefully. They specifically mentioned your training in their report. Said it had been essential for adapting to field conditions. Elise nodded but didn't look up. From her work, that's what it was designed for. When I first approved this program, I wasn't sure it would make a difference. Traditional training methods exist for good reasons. Traditional training methods work for traditional situations. When situations become non-traditional, you need different approaches. What you've created here isn't just different training. It's a different philosophy. How so? Traditional military training focuses on following procedures, maintaining standards, operating within established parameters. What you teach is how to maintain effectiveness when all of that breaks down. Elise finally looked up. What I teach is how to complete the mission when everything goes wrong. That's what my team died learning. That's what these soldiers need to know. Over the following weeks, regular reports confirmed that the deployed team was not just surviving, but excelling in conditions that would have challenged much more experienced units. Their equipment remained functional. Their adaptation to field conditions was exemplary, and their mission progress exceeded expectations. But for Elise, the real validation came when Staff Sergeant Torres returned to Fort Henderson 3 months later. He found her in the armory, working in her usual corner, maintaining weapons with the same methodical precision she had demonstrated on his first day. "Ma'am," he said quietly, approaching her workstation, "I wanted to thank you." Elise looked up, noting that he appeared healthy and confident despite having spent months in hostile territory. "For what?" "For teaching me how to think instead of just follow procedures. For showing me that adaptation isn't just acceptable, it's essential. For giving me the tools to keep my team alive when the textbook solutions didn't work." "What happened?" "Out there?" Torres pulled up a chair and sat down beside her workstation. "Everything you said would happen. Communications failed. Supply lines were disrupted. Equipment broke in ways that weren't covered in the maintenance manuals. But you adapted. We adapted. We used improvised materials for repairs. We maintained weapon function with field expedient solutions. We completed the mission because we knew how to think beyond standard procedures." Elise continued her cleaning while listening to his report. "Anyone hurt?" "Minor injuries, nothing serious. But there were situations where different training, different knowledge might have led to different outcomes." "Such as?" "Murphy's rifle took damage that should have rendered it inoperable. She had it functioning again within an hour using techniques you taught us. Kim improvised a cleaning solution that kept our weapons operational for 2 weeks when our supplies ran out." "And you?" Torres smiled. "I learned that leadership in extreme conditions isn't about having all the answers. It's about adapting, to find solutions that work. That's the most important lesson. Why didn't anyone teach us this before? Why isn't this part of standard training?" Elise paused in her work. "Because most people don't need to know it. Most soldiers will never face conditions where improvisation means survival. Most operations have adequate logistics support and reliable communications. But some don't. Some don't. And for those operations, for those soldiers, this knowledge can mean the difference between coming home and not coming home." Torres was quiet for a moment, processing the weight of what he'd experienced and learned. "There's something else I wanted to tell you. During the operation, when things got difficult, we talked about you, about your team, about what they went through." "Oh?" "It helped us understand that what we were facing wasn't impossible. It had been done before, by people who cared enough to pass on what they learned. We weren't alone out there." Elise's hand stilled on the weapon she was cleaning. "You weren't alone. My team was with you, in everything you knew how to do. That's what we figured. It made a difference, knowing that someone had faced worse conditions and found ways to succeed. They would be proud, knowing that their experience, their sacrifice, helped bring you home safely." Torres stood to leave, but paused at her workstation. "Ma'am, I'm putting in for instructor duty. I want to teach what you taught me to the next group of soldiers who might need it." "Why?" "Because this knowledge is too important to keep to myself. Because somewhere, someday, there might be another operation where what we learned could save lives." Elise looked up at him, seeing not the skeptical veteran who had arrived 6 months earlier, but a soldier who understood the true nature of service. Someone who had learned not just techniques and procedures, but purpose and responsibility. That would honor them, she said simply. Teaching others, passing on what you've learned, making sure the knowledge continues. Is that what you're doing? Honoring your team? Every day. Through every weapon cleaned, every soldier taught. Every person who goes home safely because they knew something my teammates died learning. As Torres left the armory, Elise returned to her work with renewed satisfaction. The circle was complete. Knowledge gained through sacrifice had been passed on to soldiers who needed it. Those soldiers had used that knowledge successfully and were now prepared to teach others. Her team's mission continued, carried forward by people who would never know their names, but would benefit from their sacrifice. The tattoo on her arm represented not just memory, but legacy. Not just loss, but continuity. She finished cleaning the rifle in her hands, inspected it thoroughly, and moved on to the next. The same methodical process, the same professional attention to detail, the same quiet dedication that had characterized every day since she'd chosen to honor the fallen through daily service. But now there was additional purpose in the work. Somewhere, other soldiers were teaching what she had taught them. Somewhere, other weapons were being maintained with techniques her team had helped develop. Somewhere, other people were coming home safely because knowledge had been passed from hand to hand, from mind to mind, from one generation of soldiers to the next. The general who had once lost an entire unit had found something more valuable than the soldiers he'd thought were gone forever. He'd found that their knowledge, their experience, their sacrifice could live on in ways that monuments and medals could never achieve. Elise Cade had chosen invisibility to serve a greater purpose. But in doing so, she had made herself truly visible to the people who mattered most. The soldiers who depended on her expertise. The teammates whose memories she carried. The future generations who would benefit from lessons learned in the hardest possible circumstances. Some heroes wore medals and appeared in history books. Others worked quietly in corners of military facilities, passing on knowledge that could save lives, teaching skills that could mean survival, honoring the fallen through daily dedication to keeping the living alive. As evening approached and the armory grew quiet, Elise touched the dragon tattoo on her arm one more time. 9 names, 9 friends, 9 people whose sacrifice had found purpose in ways they never could have imagined. The mission continued. The knowledge lived on. The circle remained unbroken. And in a corner of Fort Henderson's armory, a woman who had survived the impossible continued doing what she'd always done, making sure that other people's impossible situations became merely difficult. Because that's what they would have wanted. That's what real service looked like. That's what it meant to honor the fallen by serving the living. The weapons were clean. The students were trained. The mission was complete. Until tomorrow, when it would begin again. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.